18 hours straight. That's the exact duration you have to stare at the hypnotic, dotted white lines of Interstate 90 before your brain stops processing reality and starts running purely on gas station coffee and adrenaline. Sitting on the passenger seat of my truck, still carrying the faint, sharp smell of the notary's stamp pad, was a property deed. I had just traded $187,000 and 8 months of bureaucratic warfare for a 3-bedroom log cabin sitting on 12 acres of pristine, silent Montana timberland. I didn't buy this place to gut it and slap cheap modern paint over synthetic drywall. I bought it for the bones. The architecture was meant to be a masterpiece of high-end restoration, heavy natural wood grain structures anchored by solid stone textures. It was supposed to be a sanctuary, the ultimate quiet place where I could finally step away from the noise. But exactly 200 yards from my front door, the quiet violently died. It wasn't a natural sound. It was the high-pitched, agonizing scream of metal grinding against metal. A heavily used power drill, its chucks showing signs of deep, realistic metal corrosion from years in the damp air rather than just aesthetic surface wear, biting aggressively into the heavy, authentic brass of my front door lock. I threw the truck into park, the tires crunching loudly against the gravel, and stepped out into the biting morning fog. And there she was, a woman I had never seen before in my 42 years of existence, casually crouched on my front porch. She was swapping out the deadbolt with the serene, unbothered calm of someone changing a light bulb in their own hallway. She heard my boots on the gravel. She stopped the drill. She turned around. If you catch a stranger actively breaking into a building, basic human psychology dictates a physical reaction. A flinch, a stutter, a spike in heart rate that translates to wide eyes and panic. She gave me absolutely none of that. Instead, she looked at me and deployed a smile. It wasn't a nervous smile. It was a weaponized, heavily rehearsed expression of absolute moral superiority. The kind of smile you practice in a mirror until it looks natural. "I'm protecting community heritage," she said. Her voice didn't waver. It was infuriatingly calm. Clipped to the zipper of her expensive fleece jacket was a laminated ID badge. The bold text read, "Clearwater Regional Natural Heritage Coordinator," a title that sounded incredibly official, carrying the heavy weight of state authority. A title that, I would later discover, existed absolutely nowhere in any government registry, payroll, or legal framework. She had quite literally manifested it from thin air, printed it at a local copy shop, and crowned herself the undisputed CEO of nature. Her entire persona was engineered perfectly, like a flawless SEO strategy designed solely to manipulate local community algorithms and generate pure, unadulterated public sympathy. She politely, almost condescendingly, informed me that an active ecological assessment was currently underway. She told me, the legal owner of the land, that I was strictly prohibited from entering my own property until I had spoken with her conservation committee. I reached into my jacket. I pulled out the deed, a legally binding, state-recognized document proving I owned the very dirt beneath her hiking boots. She barely looked at it. She gave it the mild, irritated glance of someone turning away a flyer on the sidewalk. In her twisted, narcissistic reality, her self-appointed righteousness completely nullified my legal ownership. This is the exact moment where the internet tells you to lose your mind. This is where you start screaming, where you pull out a camera, demand her name, and escalate the situation until the police arrive with sirens blaring. I didn't do a single one of those things. I looked at her. I looked at the corroded drill in her hand. I turned around, got back into my truck, and drove away in complete silence. To Deborah, and to anyone watching, it looked like the ultimate cowardly retreat. I had folded without a single word of protest. As I pulled out, I checked my rearview mirror. She was still standing there on my porch, chest puffed out, radiating the deep satisfaction of a woman who had just watched a minor inconvenience naturally eliminate itself. She honestly thought she had won. She thought that was the end of the story. She had no idea that my silence wasn't a retreat. It was the beginning of a forensic dissection. And that specific decision, to drive away without giving her a single word of ammunition, is exactly why, less than a year later, she wouldn't just be losing her fake title. She'd be standing in a room full of 200 of her most loyal followers, publicly projecting her own signed confession onto a screen, while federal agents blocked the exits to explain why she was facing 45 years in federal prison. I parked a mile down the road and dialed 911. It took exactly 40 minutes for a single county cruiser to slowly roll up the dirt driveway. Out stepped Sergeant Dale Pruitt. If you've ever lived in a small, insular mountain town, You know exactly how this specific dynamic plays out. Pruitt didn't approach Deborah like an officer of the law responding to a potential breaking and entering. He approached her like a guy walking up to a neighbor at a Sunday barbecue. His shoulders were loose, his voice was soft. The sharp, professional distance you expect from law enforcement was entirely replaced by something far warmer and infinitely more dangerous: local bias. She fed him a practiced line about jurisdictional disputes and community heritage protection protocols. He nodded along. He never once asked her to produce a single shred of documentation. He never asked for a state ID. But when he finally turned to me, the actual, undisputed property owner standing there holding a notarized deed, he wouldn't even look me directly in the eye. He just mumbled something vaguely threatening about finding temporary accommodations while things were clarified legally. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice to demand my constitutional rights from a man who had clearly already made up his mind before he even put his cruiser in park. I just got back in my truck and left. I knew exactly what I was walking away from, and it wasn't just a generic real estate flip. I had spent months planning the renovation of that lodge. The vision was strict and uncompromising, a masterpiece of architectural craftsmanship grounded entirely in raw, authentic materials. I was bringing in heavy natural wood grain structures and solid stone textures, absolutely refusing to ruin the aesthetic with cheap modern paint or synthetic drywall. It was supposed to be a testament to permanence. And now, a woman with a fake badge was standing between me and it, backed by a local cop who was perfectly willing to look the other way. Before I even hit the main interstate, I was on the phone with my real estate attorney back in Denver. I told him I was physically locked out of my own purchase. Start pulling everything you can find on a woman named Deborah Caldwell and an organization called the Clearwater Conservation Committee, I said. Then I hung up. I checked into a sterile, cheap roadside motel, opened my laptop, and went to work. It took 48 hours for the internet to do what it does best: manufacture blind rage. My phone started vibrating endlessly with messages from friends I hadn't spoken to in months. They were all forwarding me the same link. It was a post spreading like a virus through a local Facebook group called Protect Clearwater Nature, a digital echo chamber boasting over 4,200 highly active members. Deborah had published a manifesto, but calling it a simple complaint would be an insult to her sociopathic precision. It was a carefully engineered piece of weaponized content, perfectly optimized for algorithmic outrage. She knew exactly which emotional triggers to pull to maximize engagement. The post prominently featured a photograph of me standing in front of my own lodge. But the image had been deliberately altered. The exposure was dialed down, the sky was color-corrected to look bleak and ominous, and it was shot from a low, skewed angle. It made me look imposing. It made me look like a corporate intruder rather than a guy who had just emptied his life savings to buy a cabin. The caption was a masterclass in fiction. It framed me as a ruthless, out-of-state billionaire speculator attempting to seize their sacred forest land to bulldoze it for a massive, soulless commercial resort development. The comments poured in, fast and incredibly hostile. People who had never met me, who had never seen a property deed, and who had never spoken a single syllable to me, unanimously decided that I was the villain of their story. "Get him out," they typed. "Deborah has fought for us for years. We will not let this happen." I read every single one of those comments, and I responded to absolutely none of them. Because while they were busy foaming at the mouth and feeling morally superior in a digital vacuum, I was sitting on a motel bed with a topographical map of Clearwater County unfolded across the mattress, a yellow legal pad, and the Montana Secretary of State's Public Business Database glowing on my screen. In her viral post, Deborah claimed she had spent 7 years passionately protecting this specific forest. But public tax and utility records showed my lodge had only been vacant for 3 years. The math didn't just not add up, it aggressively contradicted her entire heroic timeline. I wrote that down. Then, the campaign escalated from digital noise to formal intimidation. A local radio station ran a 90-second interview with her. Her voice actually cracked over the airwaves with what sounded like genuine, heartbreaking grief. She spoke about the community's deep, spiritual relationship with the land. And here is the truly terrifying part. She never stated a single actionable, factual falsehood. She was far too calculated to open herself up to a basic defamation suit. Every sentence she delivered was framed as a question, a dark implication, a loaded pause. I played the clip 3 times. Not because I was angry, but because I was studying her technique. This wasn't amateur manipulation. This was a highly practiced, predatory performance. Within a week, I received a formal, aggressively worded email from an entity calling itself the Clearwater Residents Council, demanding my immediate appearance at a community hearing. A reporter from a local paper left a voicemail fishing for comments on my commercial plans, and my attorney received a threatening letter from a firm called Renner & Associates, suggesting that any property transaction involving the lodge was subject to an obscure community environmental review. It sounded incredibly official. It sounded like an impenetrable wall of bureaucracy specifically designed to make a normal person give up, list the property at a massive loss, and run away just to escape the relentless headache. But I spent 3 hours digging through the state registry, tracing corporate structures and tax IDs. None of these entities, not the Residents Council, not the Conservation Committee, not the Alliance, showed up anywhere in the database as legally incorporated organizations. They were phantom entities. Literally just intimidating names typed at the top of a Microsoft Word document to create the illusion of a massive, coordinated resistance. But then, I found the single, fatal thread that would eventually unravel her entire existence. I opened the Montana Secretary of State's registry and entered 2 simple words: Caldwell. Clearwater. The result loaded in 4 seconds. Clearwater Natural Heritage Alliance, LLC. Registered in 2019. Sole registered agent, Deborah and Caldwell. And the registered business address? It was the exact street address of my log cabin. My home, the property I held the deed to, had been listed as the official corporate headquarters of her organization for 5 years. Without my knowledge. Without the knowledge of the previous owner. Deborah hadn't just stolen my front door, she had been quietly living inside my legal paper trail for half a decade. She felt so utterly untouchable, so absolutely certain of her localized power, that she tied her primary financial entity directly to the physical ground I now legally owned. She had written so passionately about how she had spent 7 years protecting that forest. So, I decided it was time to stop reading and finally go for a walk in her sacred, protected woods. And what I found hiding beneath the dense canopy wasn't nature. It was the smell of chemical rot and a multi-million-dollar federal crime scene. I didn't just wander into the woods looking for a fight. I went in entirely ghosted. I rented a painfully generic gray pickup truck, completely devoid of out-of-state plates, and drove in from the north along a forgotten forestry access road that vaguely connected to the back boundary of my property. I parked 2 miles out and walked the rest of the way. My loadout wasn't hiking gear. It was a high-resolution telephoto camera, a dedicated handheld GPS unit, and a stack of sterile soil sample bags I picked up from a commercial agricultural supply store in Missoula. Prior to this little excursion, I had pulled 3 years of satellite imagery from the USGS Earth Explorer database. If you know how to read the topological data, forests tell their own stories. I had identified a specific section of the canopy to the northeast that was thinning out. And it wasn't thinning in the random, scattered pattern of natural die-off or standard fire management. It was forming a distinct, engineered geometric shape. After 40 minutes of bushwhacking, I found it. It was a road. Not a hiking trail, not an old game path. A 4-meter-wide haul road, aggressively compacted with heavy gravel and crushed structural stone, cutting a nearly perfect straight line beneath the tree canopy. The surface was firm, designed to carry extreme weight, and the drainage was professionally engineered. This thing was built specifically to avoid being visible from any public access point or main highway. I photographed everything. I treated the forest like a crime scene. I logged every GPS coordinate, meticulously matching them to the satellite anomalies. I bagged soil samples from 3 different locations along the route. That's when the smell hit me. It was faint, but absolutely unmistakable. A sharp, chemical stench lingering underneath the damp pine and earth. It wasn't diesel or petroleum. It was something synthetic. I couldn't name it right then, but I flagged the exact coordinates and bagged a double sample of the contaminated dirt. On the drive back into town, I stopped at a local hardware and contractor supply store. I bought a few basic items and struck up a casual conversation with a kid named Marcus at the register. Just general contractor small talk. Nothing that raises flags. I casually asked about any recent bulk structural orders in the area, framing it as curiosity about local development. He didn't even hesitate. He mentioned that a local conservation organization had been placing massive, regular orders for months. Pallets of gravel, structural aggregate, heavy-duty corrugated drainage piping. He named Deborah's organization without me even prompting him. I smiled, played dumb, and asked if he had the public manifest. He printed 3 months of invoices and handed them over with a single staple through the top left corner. I sat in my rental truck in the parking lot and stared at those receipts for a long time. Road building materials, purchased with nonprofit conservation funds, used to construct a private, illegal haul road through protected federal timberland. The outline of her operation was becoming impossible to ignore, and apparently, she realized I was looking, because that's exactly when they started watching me back. I walked out of my motel the next morning to find the front right tire of my rental truck completely flat. It wasn't a slow leak from a nail. It was a clean, straight cut right through the sidewall, exactly 2 inches long, made with something incredibly sharp and highly intentional. That evening, I noticed my driver's side mirror had been folded inward. It takes a deliberate, heavy hand movement to fold those specific mirrors. Someone had walked right up to my vehicle in broad daylight, in the middle of a motel parking lot, and touched it. A silent, psychological message indicating they weren't afraid of being seen. 2 hours later, my phone lit up with a text from an unknown local number. You should go back to Denver. This forest doesn't treat outsiders well. A normal person would have panicked. I just took a screenshot, logged the timestamp, and kept moving. Intimidation is just data. It tells you exactly how scared your opponent is. I drove 2 hours out of county to the nearest electronics retailer. I paid cash for 4 compact, high-definition wireless cameras with solar battery arrays and encrypted cloud storage. I bought a magnetic, industrial-grade GPS tracker, and I bought a high-fidelity, omnidirectional audio recorder. I approached the whole setup like I was directing a multi-camera shoot, where the lighting was non-existent and the subjects were entirely hostile. Working in absolute pitch black outside my property boundary that night, I established my own surveillance grid. I positioned the cameras at intersecting angles covering the main entrance, the northwest property corner, the driveway approach, and the front parking area. The GPS tracker went straight under the frame rail of Deborah's moss green SUV while it sat completely unattended in a public lot. Then, I sat in the dark and waited. On the third night, at exactly 3:47 in the morning, the motion alerts on my phone started firing. A massive, commercial timber truck, running completely dark without full headlights and deliberately missing its front license plate, rolled heavily down the approach from the northeast. It pulled into the lodge's front drive and idled. Within 2 minutes, the front door of my house opened. Deborah walked out. She had been awake and waiting. 2 other unidentified figures emerged from the tree line on foot. There was a brief, hushed exchange near the tailgate of the truck. After 25 minutes of loading, the truck reversed back toward the concealed haul road and vanished into the fog. But the audio recorder I had tucked near the perimeter fence caught fragments of Deborah's phone call immediately after the truck departed. Next shipment before Friday. The Alliance account is ready. I sat in my motel room and watched that footage play out on my screen 6 times in a row. I didn't rewatch it because I missed a detail. I rewatched it to appreciate the absolute arrogance of it all. I needed to be unequivocally certain of the narrative before I pitched this story to the only audience that actually mattered. The following afternoon, the soil sample results came back from the independent laboratory in Missoula. The report officially identified highly elevated concentrations of imazapyr. For those who aren't familiar with industrial forestry, imazapyr is a brutal, broad-spectrum herbicide used to violently suppress all competing vegetation after a commercial timber harvest. In private, open timber country, it's a standard, albeit toxic, tool. But in a federally designated conservation zone, it is explicitly, federally prohibited. Deborah wasn't just illegally clear-cutting the mature trees. She was actively, chemically poisoning the soil to prevent the native forest from ever growing back, all while publicly crying about protecting the sacred ecosystem. I opened usaspending.gov, the federal government's public database that painstakingly tracks every single dollar of grant expenditure, and searched the Alliance's name. 3 distinct federal grants loaded onto my screen. $110,000 from the Department of the Interior in 2020, $90,000 from the EPA in 2021, and a massive $140,000 from the Interior again in 2023. A total of $340,000 of federal conservation funding, all funneled directly toward protecting the exact same forest that the satellite imagery proved was being systematically dismantled and poisoned. I didn't call the local police. I didn't call Sergeant Pruitt. I picked up my phone and dialed the Inspector General's direct hotline for the Department of the Interior. I was transferred twice before a voice answered. Sharp, alert, and carrying zero tolerance for small talk. Special Agent Rachel Huang, FBI Field Office, Helena. Her specialty? Environmental fraud and severe federal grant abuse. I didn't give her a sob story. I gave her raw, unadulterated data. I walked her through the exact dates, the dollar amounts, the matching GPS coordinates, the satellite topology comparisons, the laboratory chemical results, the hardware invoices, and the time-stamped, multi-angle camera footage. She listened in absolute silence for nearly 8 minutes. The line was so quiet I could hear her breathing. When I finally finished, there was a heavy, for-second pause. "Mr. Collins," she said, her voice dropping an octave, "I need you to preserve everything exactly as it is. Do not move a single file. And discuss this with absolutely no one. That includes your local attorney." I understood exactly what she meant without asking her to clarify. Sergeant Pruitt's name was already written on my yellow legal pad, circled twice in red ink. For the next 3 weeks, I vanished. I went completely, agonizingly silent. I made no public statements, I granted no interviews, and I ignored every single demand to attend their pathetic community hearings. To the outside world, and more importantly to Deborah, I looked completely exhausted. I looked stalled. I looked exactly like a defeated man silently reconsidering whether this lodge was actually worth the mental toll. That was the exact psychological impression I needed her to have. Because while I maintained that dead stillness, Agent Huang's specialized federal team was quietly ripping the alliance's financial records down to the studs. And what they found in those offshore LLCs was going to make Deborah wish I had just yelled at her on the porch that first morning. Financial audits are brutal, emotionless machines. You can gaslight a community board, you can manipulate a local police officer with a smile and a fake badge, and you can certainly lie to 4,000 people on Facebook. But you cannot gaslight a spreadsheet. You cannot manipulate a forensic accountant at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Agent Huang's team didn't just look at the alliance's surface-level tax returns. They ripped the entire financial structure down to the molecular level. And what they discovered was a masterclass in hubris. Of the $340,000 in federal grant money deposited directly into the alliance's operating account, $210,000 had been siphoned outward. It was disbursed through 7 separate, meticulously timed invoices, all generically labeled as environmental consulting fees. These fees were paid out to a network of obscure LLCs that shared no physical corporate addresses, no registered employee records, and absolutely no operational history. Every single one of those shadow LLCs traced directly back to private bank accounts that Deborah and Caldwell controlled. Meanwhile, completely independent of the financial audit, U.S. Forest Service agents were physically walking the Hidden Hall Road. They officially confirmed that exactly 340 mature ponderosa pine and western larch trees had been violently harvested from protected federal land without a single permit. The estimated value of the stolen timber at current market rates was roughly $180,000. When you combine the siphoned federal grant funds with the stolen timber, her total financial exposure effortlessly exceeded $500,000. And that was before the catastrophic chemical damage of the imazapyr was even factored into the sentencing guidelines. But here is a fundamental truth about malignant narcissists. When the walls start closing in, they don't self-reflect. They double down. Deborah started feeling her cash flow mysteriously tighten. Her accounts were likely being quietly frozen or flagged by federal monitors, though she couldn't comprehend why. So, panicking, she made her fatal mistake. She decided to fabricate a document. Not just a fake ID badge this time. She drafted a formal emergency conservation management agreement, and she physically forged what purported to be the official signature and institutional seal of the Bureau of Land Management's Clearwater Field office. Armed with a forged federal seal, she walked into a regional bank and confidently applied for an $80,000 commercial bridge loan to cover her sudden operational deficit. But she didn't account for the bank's compliance officer. A nameless, unsung hero sitting in a cubicle who took one look at the BLM seal, recognized the formatting was completely inconsistent with current federal document standards, and quietly flagged the file. The bank contacted the FBI within the hour. The loan never processed. Instead, it instantly became Exhibit 14 in a federal case that was rapidly evolving from a standard fraud investigation into a massive, multi-count federal indictment. Every single frantic move she made to stabilize her crumbling empire just added another 10 years to her sentencing exposure. Then, the invitation arrived. It dropped into my inbox on a Tuesday morning, blasted out through the community group's public email list. An emergency public forum, scheduled for Saturday evening at the Ridgefield Community Hall. Item 3 on the official agenda read, property owner Scott Collins will present his development intentions to the community for open review. It was framed as a polite, democratic invitation. It was structured entirely, as a public execution. She wanted to drag me into a room packed with her loyalists, humiliate me, and publicly force me to abandon the property. I accepted by return email within 20 minutes. I called Agent Huang that afternoon. I kept it brief. She's organizing a public meeting this Saturday. She'll have her full documentation on display. There was a brief, highly professional pause on the other end of the line. We've been anticipating something like this, Mr. Collins. We will be positioned accordingly. I arrived at the Ridgefield Community Hall completely alone. No real estate attorney, no private security, no defensive posture. I carried nothing but a single, unremarkable manila folder. I walked in, sat quietly in the third row, and didn't speak a single word to the locals glaring at me. Deborah took the stage at exactly 7:07 p.m. She was wearing her signature moss green Alliance jacket, her silver hair set precisely. She carried the heavy gravity of someone who had rehearsed her own moral authority in a mirror until it felt like a natural bodily function. She grabbed the microphone and thanked the packed room for showing up to defend what belongs to all of us. The applause was deafening, immediate, cult-like. Then, she began presenting her binder. 47 pages, printed in high resolution and bound professionally, projected onto a massive screen behind her. The first section was a highly curated history of the Alliance. Beautiful photographs, glowing letters from compromised county officials, sweeping images of the forest she claimed to have single-handedly saved. Then she reached the third section, the section she had custom-built to establish her unshakable legal standing as the legitimate, community-appointed steward of my lodge. She advanced the slide to page 23 and let it fill the massive screen. It was a contract. At the top, in clear, undeniable print, it read, Pacific Northwest Timber Partners, LLC. Below that were the heavily detailed terms of a commercial timber harvesting agreement covering the exact northeast corridor of the Clearwater Forest. Signed in blue ink by Deborah and Caldwell on behalf of the Alliance. Dated spring 2022. Valued at $220,000. The room went quiet. Not a respectful quiet. The heavy, suffocating silence of 200 people simultaneously realizing they had been played. A man in the third row, maybe 60 years old, with the weathered build of someone who had worked outside his entire life, slowly raised his hand. Deborah, he said, his voice echoing in the dead room. You've spent this entire presentation telling us you're protecting the forest. That contract on the screen, that's a clear-cut timber sale agreement. A second voice chimed in from the left aisle. A retired Forest Service worker who immediately recognized the corporate name and loudly pointed out that Pacific Northwest Timber Partners held absolutely no valid extraction permits in Clearwater County. The murmurs shifted register. The anger in the room was rapidly changing direction. I stood up. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. I just waited until I had Deborah's eyes completely locked on mine. And then, with absolute, terrifying evenness, I spoke into the quiet room. Page 31. Show them page 31. Her hand hesitated over the laptop trackpad. Her brain was completely short-circuiting. Because she hadn't prepared a script for this specific instruction, and because she was operating purely on adrenaline and panic, she did the dumbest thing she could possibly do. She actually advanced the slide. Page 31 appeared on the screen, 10 feet tall. It was a bank transfer record. $47,000 moved directly from the Alliance's nonprofit operating account into a private, personal checking account registered solely in the name of Deborah and Caldwell. The memo line read, Management consulting fee. Her mouth literally fell open. For the very first time in this entire drawn-out saga, she had absolutely no rehearsed, self-righteous line to deliver. The CEO of Nature was completely bankrupt. At exactly 7:43 p.m., the heavy double doors at the back of the Ridgefield Community Hall swung open. I heard them before I even turned to look. It's a very specific, heavy sound. The sound of multiple, heavily armed people moving together with coordinated, tactical purpose. Special Agent Rachel Huang walked down the center aisle first, her federal badge held open at chest level. She was flanked by 3 other federal agents and 2 IRS Criminal Investigation Division officers in plain clothes. The entire room turned. 200 heads swiveled in a single, slow, cinematic wave as the community realized that the public execution they had come to witness was indeed happening, just not to the person they expected. Agent Huang didn't bother taking the podium. She stood right beside it, held her federal credentials up where the entire room could verify them, and looked directly at the stage. My name is Special Agent Rachel Huang, FBI Field Office, Helena. Miss Caldwell, I need you to step away from the computer and remain exactly where you are. Then, she read the charges to the dead silent room. Federal grant fraud. $340,000 misappropriated from the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Unauthorized harvesting of federal forest resources. Falsification of federal documents. Bank fraud. Money laundering. Agent Huang paused, letting the words sink in. Maximum combined sentencing exposure. 45 years in federal custody. Financial penalties up to $1.75 million. Deborah turned toward the audience. Her audience. The thousands of people she had spent years carefully cultivating and manipulating. And with a voice that still carried the pathetic ghost of its former authority, she tried one last time. I have given 7 years to protecting this land, she pleaded, her voice shaking. Everything I did was for this community. Agent Huang waited politely for her to finish her performance. Then, she responded without a single drop of inflection. The documentation you voluntarily presented on that screen tonight constitutes the central evidentiary exhibit in this federal case. We highly appreciate you making it available in a witnessed, recorded public setting. The heavy steel handcuffs closed sharply around Deborah Caldwell's wrists at exactly 7:51 p.m. She was walked out through the back doors, paraded past 200 people who had shown up eager to watch an out-of-towner be humiliated. Instead, they got to watch the woman they blindly trusted face the absolute, crushing consequence of what she had actually been doing in their name. The following morning, I drove up the dirt road completely alone. There was no moss green SUV blocking the entrance. There were no power drill sounds echoing in the morning fog. I parked my truck in front of my own door. I took out my key, the lock I had paid a professional locksmith to install, and I turned it. The heavy door opened into a space that smelled of old wood, cold air, and the very specific silence of a building that had been waiting a long, long time for the right person to walk inside. Through the massive east-facing window, just past the tree line at the edge of the property, I could make out the bright fluorescent vests of a specialized federal ecological restoration crew. They had arrived 3 days earlier to begin the massive replanting effort in the Northeast Corridor. Small, bright figures moving diligently between the toxic stumps, carrying saplings. The forest had been brutally harvested, but it was finally being returned. I stepped inside my home, and the door swung closed behind me. For the first time in this entire story, there was absolutely nothing left for me to document. There is an alternate universe where Scott Collins drives back to Denver after that very first morning, incredibly bitter, thoroughly defeated, and utterly convinced that the system is simply too broken and corrupt to bother fighting. Nobody would have blamed him for walking away, but he didn't. And the reason he won has absolutely nothing to do with luck. It comes down to 4 brutal rules of engagement that anyone dealing with a narcissist needs to apply. Rule number 1. Anger is a luxury. Documentation is an asset. Every single minute you spend screaming and defending yourself in a physical space that your opponent controls is a minute they are using to consolidate their power. A time-stamped photograph, a verified GPS coordinate, a certified lab result. These things don't win loud arguments on front porches. They win federal cases. Rule number 2. Know exactly which door to knock on. Do not waste a single ounce of your energy trying to convince a compromised local police officer or a Facebook crowd that has already made up its mind. Identify the exact jurisdictional level at which your problem actually exists and deliver your evidence there without detour. Rule number 3. Silence is a weapon. The people who habitually abuse power are almost always undone by the quiet they cannot tolerate. They are addicted to the conflict. When you deny them a reaction, they fill the void themselves. They literally cannot stop themselves from making mistakes. What Deborah read as my paralysis was actually 3 solid weeks of a forensic federal audit running quietly in the background on every single account she held. And rule number 4. Arrogance is always its own star witness. Deborah didn't fall because I was some kind of tactical genius. She fell because she was so incredibly certain of her own ability to control the narrative that she confidently walked into a public room and projected her own signed, undeniable evidence onto a massive screen, in front of 200 witnesses and 4 federal agents. Document everything. Find the right agency. Stay dead quiet with absolute intention. And trust that people who build their entire empire on deception are always exactly one public presentation away from destroying it themselves.